How's it going, y'all? So we're going to read some more of General von Clausewitz. This is going to be 6 through 10 in 1827. This is on war, but this is the book on the nature of war, and this is the chapter What is War. So these sections are all different sections. They're short little sections out of here. Let's go ahead and get into this. So start with section number 6. Modification in the reality. Thus, reasoning in the abstract, the mind cannot stop short of an extreme because it has to deal with an extreme, with a conflict of forces left to themselves, and obeying no other but their own inner laws. If we should seek to deduce from the pure conception of war an absolute point for the aim, which we shall propose, and for the means which we shall apply, this constant reciprocal action would involve us in extremes, which would be nothing but a play of ideas, produced by an almost invisible train of logical subtleties. If adhering closely to the absolute, we try to avoid all difficulties by a stroke of the pen, and insist with logical strictness that in every case the extreme must be the object, and the utmost effort must be exerted in that direction, such a stroke of the pen would be a mere paper law, not by any means adapted to the real world. Even supposing this extreme tension of forces was an absolute which could easily be ascertained, we must admit that the human mind would hardly submit itself to this kind of logical chimera. There would be, in many cases, an unnecessary waste of power, which would be in opposition to other principles of statecraft. An effort of will would be required disproportioned to the proposed object, which therefore it would be impossible to realize, for the human will does not derive its impulse from logical subtleties. But everything takes a different shape when we pass from abstractions to reality. In the former, everything must be subject to optimism, and we must imagine the one side as well as the other, striving after perfection, and even attaining it. Will this ever take place in reality? It will if, 1, war becomes a completely isolated act which arises suddenly and is in no way connected with the previous history of the combatant states. 2, if it is limited to a single solution or to several simultaneous solutions. 3, if it contains within itself the solution perfect and complete, free from any reaction upon it through a calculation beforehand of the political situation which will follow from it. Okay, so this is number 7. War is never an isolated act. Something that's kind of important to understand about war, because the way propaganda kind of works in the United States is they show an isolated act and does not show anything other context. And if you bring in context, they say that's whataboutism, but you need context to understand war, because there is never just pops up randomly out of nowhere. Okay. With regard to the first point, neither of the two opponents is an abstract person to the other, not even as regards that factor in the sum of resistance, which does not depend on objective things, viz., the will. This will is not an entirely unknown quantity. It indicates what it will be tomorrow by what it is today. War does not spring up quite suddenly. It does not spread to the full in a moment. Each of the two opponents can, therefore, form an opinion of the other, in a great measure, from what he is and what he does, instead of judging of him according to what he, strictly speaking, should be or should do. But now, man with his incomplete organization is always below the line of absolute perfection, and thus these deficiencies, having an influence on both sides, become a modifying principle. 8. War does not consist of a single instantaneous blow. The second point gives rise to the following considerations. If war ended in a single solution or a number of simultaneous ones, then naturally all the preparations for the same would have a tendency to the extreme, for an omission could not in any way be repaired. The utmost, then, that the world of reality could furnish as a guide for us would be the preparations of the enemy, as far as they are known to us. All the rest would fall into the domain of the abstract. But if the result is made up from several successive acts, then naturally that which proceeds with all its phases may be taken as a measure for that which will follow. And in this manner, the world of reality again takes the place of the abstract, and thus modifies the effort towards the extreme. Yet every war would necessarily resolve itself into a single solution, or a sum of simultaneous results, if all the means required for the struggle were raised at once, or could be at once raised. For as one adverse result necessarily diminishes the means, then if all the means have been applied in the first, a second cannot properly be supposed. All hostile acts which might follow would belong essentially to the first, in form and reality only its duration. But we have already seen that even in the preparation for war, the real world steps into the place of mere abstract conception, a material standard into the place of the hypothesis of an extreme. That therefore, in that way, both parties, by the influence of the mutual reaction, remain below the line of extreme effort, and therefore all forces are not at once brought forward. It lies also in the nature of these forces in their application that they cannot all be brought into activity at the same time. These forces are the armies actually on foot, the country with its superficial extent and its population, and the allies. In point of fact, the country with its superficial area and the population, besides being the source of all military force, constitute in itself an integral part of the efficient quantities in war, providing either the theater of war or exercising a considerable influence on the same. Now, it is possible to bring all the movable military forces of a country into operation at once, but not all fortresses, rivers, mountains, people, and in short, not the whole country, unless it is so small that it may be completely embraced by the first act of the war. Further, the cooperation of allies does not depend on the will of the belligerents, and from the nature of the political relations of states to each other, this cooperation is frequently not afforded until after the war has commenced. Wow, my phone just closed out. The page just closed out for some reason right now. Have to go find out where I was. And therefore, in that way, both parties, by the influence of the mutual reaction, remain below the line of extreme effort, and therefore all forces are not at once brought forward. Is that where I was at? The war has commenced, or it may be increased to restore the balance of power. I think that's where I was at. So I'll start from that sentence. Further, the cooperation of allies does not depend on the will of the belligerents. And from the nature of the political relations of states to each other, this cooperation is frequently not afforded until after the war has commenced, or it may be increased to restore the balance of power. That this part of the means of resistance, which cannot at once be brought into activity, in many cases is a much greater part of the whole than might at first be supposed, and that it often restores the balance of power seriously affected by the great force of the first decision, will be more fully shown hereafter. Here it is sufficient to show that a complete concentration of all available means in a moment of time is contradictory to the nature of war. Now this, in itself, furnishes no ground for relaxing our efforts to accumulate strength to gain the first result, because an unfavorable issue is always a disadvantage to which no one would purposely expose himself, and also because the first decision, although not the only one, still will have the more influence on subsequent events, the greater it is in itself. But the possibility of gaining a later result causes men to take refuge in that expectation, owing to the repugnance in the human mind to making excessive efforts, and therefore forces are not concentrated and measures are not taken for the first decision with that energy, which would otherwise be used. Whatever one belligerent omits from weakness becomes to the other a real objective ground for limiting his own efforts, and thus again, through his reciprocal action, extreme tendencies are brought down to efforts on a limited scale. 9. The result in war is never absolute. Lastly, even if the final decision of a whole war is not always to be regarded as absolute, the conquered state often sees in it only a passing evil, which may be repaired in after times by means of political combinations. How much this must modify the degree of tension and the vigor of the efforts made is evident in itself. 10. The probabilities of real life take the place of the conceptions of the extreme and the absolute. In this manner, the whole act of war is removed from the rigorous law of forces exerted to the utmost. If the extreme is no longer to be apprehended and no longer to be sought for, it is left to the judgment to determine the limits for the efforts to be made in place of it. And this can only be done on the data furnished by the facts of the real world by the laws of probability. Once the belligerents are no longer mere conceptions, but individual states and governments. Once the war is no longer an ideal, but a definite substantial procedure. Then the reality will furnish the data to compute the unknown quantities which are required to be found. From the character, the measures, the situation of the adversary, and the relations with which he is surrounded, each side will draw conclusions by the law of probability as to the designs of the other and act accordingly. Okay, yeah, so that is That is On War by Clausewitz, by General Clausewitz, 1827, parts 6 through 10. That was book 1 on the nature of war, and chapter 1, what is war. Okay, well, thank y'all for tuning in. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, Medium. All of these are Marxist. Hit me up there. Y'all have a great day. Todara goi.